Life has a way of sneaking up on you. You settle into a routine, convinced you know how everything fits. Your relationships, your future, your own emotions. And then, without warning, something shifts. It could be a single conversation, a fleeting moment, or a quiet realization that leaves you questioning everything you thought was certain. For me, it started with Daniel. To everyone else, Daniel was just my younger brother. The kid who trailed behind me when we were little, always asking too many questions, always looking up to me in ways I never paid much attention to. He was quieter than I was, always lost in his own world, while I had my own life to focus on. We were close in the way that siblings are, always around each other, sharing childhood mischief, but never particularly deep. I had always been the older one, the responsible one, the one with my head full of school, friends, and later, college. Daniel was just there, a presence in the background of my life. The kid who stole my snacks, who made me laugh at the worst times, who always seemed to be waiting for me to acknowledge him in a way I never really did. But when I came back home after years away, something was different. I wasn't expecting change. The house was the same, our parents were the same, and in my mind, Daniel would be the same too. But when I saw him again, I realized how much I had underestimated time. He had grown, not just taller, but in a way that was harder to explain. There was a confidence in the way he moved, a quiet presence that hadn't been there before. And for the first time in my life, I noticed him. It wasn't supposed to be like that. He was my brother. The same kid who used to fall asleep in the backseat of the car on long drives. The same kid who once cried over a lost toy. So why did it suddenly feel like I was looking at a stranger? I told myself it was nothing. Just the natural shift of time and distance. People grow. People change. I was just seeing him in a new light, nothing more. But as the days passed, that explanation started to feel like a lie. Because it wasn't just that he had changed. It was the way he looked at me too. I kept brushing it off, telling myself I was imagining things. But the signs were there. Small, barely noticeable, but impossible to ignore once I saw them. The way Daniel's gaze lingered a second too long when I spoke. The way he laughed at my jokes, even the bad ones. The way he always found reasons to be near me, to talk, to stay close. At first, I convinced myself it was nothing, just a side effect of being apart for so long. Maybe he was just happy to have me back. Maybe I was just reading into things too much. But deep down, a voice I didn't want to acknowledge whispered the truth. Something was shifting between us, and I didn't know how to stop it. The night it all truly began was an ordinary one. At least, that's what I thought. The rain had stopped earlier in the evening, leaving the backyard damp, the scent of wet earth thick in the air. The sky was clear now, a deep, endless blue scattered with stars. Daniel and I sat outside on the porch, each with a drink in hand, letting the silence settle between us. It wasn't unusual for us to talk like this, reminiscing about childhood, sharing bits and pieces of our separate lives. But that night felt different. "I used to think you were the coolest person in the world," Daniel said suddenly, his voice quieter than usual. I chuckled, shaking my head. "Used to?" He smiled, but it wasn't his usual teasing grin. It was something else. Something unsure. "Yeah. When we were kids, I always wanted to be like you. You always seemed like you had everything figured out. Confident, smart, fearless." I turned my head to look at him, surprised by the admission. "You never told me that." Daniel shrugged, looking up at the stars. "Didn't think I needed to." A comfortable silence stretched between us, but I could feel something unspoken hanging in the air. I should have let it go. I should have ignored the strange feeling twisting in my chest. But I didn't. "What changed?" I asked, my voice quieter now. Daniel hesitated, his fingers tightening slightly around his glass. "I don't see you the same way anymore." Something inside me froze. My mind raced, trying to grasp the meaning behind his words. But at the same time, I already knew. I swallowed hard, forcing a nervous laugh. "That's a weird thing to say, Daniel." He turned to look at me then, his gaze steady, searching mine, waiting for a reaction. "Is it?" I should have laughed it off. I should have changed the subject, pretended like I didn't understand what he was saying. But I didn't. Because in that moment, sitting under the stars, I couldn't lie to myself anymore. I felt it too. I stood up abruptly, brushing my hands against my jeans and pretending I was cold. "We should head inside. It's getting late." Daniel watched me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded and followed me inside, his footsteps quiet on the porch steps. But even as I walked ahead, I could feel his gaze on my back, lingering, heavy, as though he was trying to read my thoughts. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, Daniel's words echoed in my mind. "I don't see you the same way anymore." I tossed and turned, pulling the blanket over my head as if I could block out the thoughts racing through my mind. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself that I had misunderstood him, deep down, I knew the truth. And worse, a part of me didn't want to ignore it. The next morning, I avoided him. It was childish, but I wasn't ready to face whatever was happening between us. I busied myself in the kitchen, focusing on making coffee, scrolling through my phone, anything to keep my mind occupied. But of course, Daniel wasn't going to let that slide. "Are you avoiding me?" His voice startled me, and I nearly spilled my coffee as I turned to see him leaning against the doorway. He was watching me carefully, arms crossed, waiting for an answer. I forced a casual shrug. "Why would I be avoiding you?" Daniel raised an eyebrow, the corner of his mouth quirking up in a way that made my heart skip a beat. "You tell me." I hated how well he could see through me. It wasn't fair. "I just have a lot on my mind," I muttered, taking a sip of my coffee and avoiding his gaze. He didn't respond right away, and for a moment, I hoped, that maybe he would let it go. But instead, he stepped closer, his voice softer now. "Is it about last night?" My grip on the mug tightened. I wanted to tell him no. I wanted to say that I hadn't even thought about it, that it was a meaningless conversation, that nothing had changed. But when I finally looked at him, I knew he wouldn't believe me. "Daniel, I hesitated, swallowing hard. I don't know what to say." For a long moment, he just stared at me. Then, to my surprise, he smiled. But it wasn't the teasing or easygoing grin I was used to. It was something sadder, something knowing. "You don't have to say anything," he said quietly, backing away. "I just needed to know." And just like that, he walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there with my heart pounding in my chest. I should have felt relieved, but instead, it felt like I had just let something slip away, and I wasn't sure if I wanted it back or not. The days that followed were strange. Daniel didn't bring up that night again, and I was grateful for it. But something between us had shifted, and no matter how much we tried to pretend otherwise, we both felt it. We weren't fighting. We weren't avoiding each other. But there was a distance now, an invisible line neither of us was willing to cross. And yet, despite the silence, despite my attempts to push it all away, I started to notice things I had never noticed before. The way he ran his hand through his hair when he was thinking. The way his voice softened when he spoke to me. The way he lingered just a second longer than necessary when we crossed paths in the hallway. I told myself I was overanalyzing things, that I was just seeing him differently because of what he had said. But deep down, I knew the truth. One evening, I was curled up on the couch, flipping through a book I wasn't really reading, when Daniel walked in. He hesitated in the doorway, like he was debating whether to turn around. But then he sighed and sat down on the other end of the couch. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound coming from the ticking clock on the wall. Then, finally, he spoke. "I don't want things to be weird between us." I swallowed hard, keeping my eyes on the pages of my book. "They're not." Daniel let out a quiet laugh. "You're a terrible liar." I closed the book with a sigh and finally looked at him. I don't know how to act around you anymore." His expression softened. "Then don't act. Just be." It sounded so simple, but nothing about this felt simple. I wanted to tell him that I didn't feel anything, that this was all in his head. But I couldn't, because the truth was, I felt it too. The pull, the shift, the thing neither of us could name, and I didn't know how to stop it. I stood up abruptly, needing an escape. "I'm going to bed." Daniel nodded, but there was something in his eyes, something I didn't have the courage to face. As I walked away, I could feel his gaze lingering on me, like a weight I couldn't shake off. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't going to go away, no matter how hard I tried to fight it. I thought that if I ignored it long enough, it would go away, that maybe, if I kept my distance, the strange tension between us would fade, and things would go back to how they used to be. But life doesn't work that way. And neither did Daniel. It was a rainy Sunday afternoon, the kind where the whole world felt slow and quiet. The sound of raindrops tapping against the windows filled the house, and the air smelled like damp earth and brewing coffee. I was sitting at the dining table, scrolling through my phone, when Daniel pulled out a deck of cards and dropped it in front of me. "Let's play," he said casually. I raised an eyebrow. "What?" "You heard me?" he said, smirking. "It's just a game." I hesitated. There was something in his voice, something light, playful, but also something deeper. A challenge. I could have said no. I should have said no. But I didn't. "Fine," I said, picking up the deck and shuffling the cards. "But I'm not going easy on you." Daniel grinned. "Wouldn't expect you to." At first it was normal. We played, we laughed, we teased each other the way we always had. And for a little while, it felt like things really were normal again. But then, something shifted. It was subtle at first. Just a glance, a touch, a moment that lasted a little too long. Every time our fingers brushed as we passed the cards, my stomach twisted in ways I didn't understand. Every time I looked up and caught him watching me, my heart pounded in my chest. I told myself I was imagining it, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then, it happened. I reached for the deck at the same time he did, and for a brief second, our hands overlapped. It was nothing. Just a touch. A simple, meaningless touch. But it didn't feel meaningless. The air in the room shifted, heavy with something unspoken. I should have pulled away. I should have laughed it off. But I didn't. And neither did he. For the first time, we just looked at each other. Really looked. And in that silence, I knew. I wasn't imagining this. It was real. And that terrified me more than anything. I barely breathed. Daniel's hand was still under mine, warm against my skin, and neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. The sound of rain outside filled the silence, steady and rhythmic against the windows. But everything else, the world, the house, even time itself, felt like it had come to a stop. I should have pulled away. I should have broken whatever moment was happening between us. But I didn't. Instead, Daniel was the one who moved first. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his hand, his fingers brushing against my palm before slipping away. It was such a small thing, but it sent a shiver down my spine. "I need to ask you something," he said, his voice quieter than before. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "What?" He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. Then, "You feel it too, don't you?" I froze. My instinct was to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, that this was just in his head. But I couldn't. Because I did feel it. And the way he was looking at me, the way his eyes searched mine, waiting for an answer, told me that he already knew the truth. I dropped my gaze, my fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "Daniel, I don't know what you want me to say. I just want you to be honest," he said, his voice steady. Honest. The word felt heavy, like it carried too much weight. But how could I be honest about something I didn't even understand? I forced a shaky breath. Even if I did, it doesn't change anything. "Doesn't it?" Daniel asked, leaning forward slightly. "Because it feels like it's changed everything." I shook my head, pushing my chair back. "I can't do this." Daniel's expression didn't change. He didn't look hurt or angry, just resigned. "I'm not asking for anything," he said softly. "I just needed to know." And with that, he stood up and walked away, leaving me alone with the pounding of my heart. I should have felt relief, but all I felt was the weight of everything we weren't saying. The tension between us became unbearable. Days passed, and neither of us spoke about what had happened at the table. But it was there, in the way we moved around each other, in the silence that stretched between us. I pretended things were normal. I went through the motions of my routine, convinced myself that if I acted like nothing had changed, maybe it would go back to how it was before. But Daniel wasn't playing the same game. He stopped pretending. He didn't avoid me. He didn't act like everything was fine. Instead, he watched me. Not in an obvious or intrusive way, but in a way that made it impossible for me to forget what had happened. Like he was waiting, testing me. One night, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, staring at the flickering glow of the television without really watching it. My mind was too full, too tangled with thoughts I didn't want to have. I didn't hear Daniel come in until he sat down beside me. He didn't speak right away. He just sat there, close but not touching, his presence enough to make my pulse quicken. Finally, he broke the silence. "This isn't going away, is it?" I swallowed hard, gripping the blanket draped over my lap. "Daniel, I just need to know," he said, his voice low. "If you want me to stop, to forget everything, I will. But if you feel it too..." He trailed off, waiting. I squeezed my eyes shut. I wanted to lie. I wanted to tell him that I felt nothing, that he was wrong, that we could go back. But I couldn't. Not when every glance, every breath, every second in the same room as him made my pulse race. Slowly, I turned to face him, and the moment our eyes met, I knew I was standing at the edge of something I couldn't walk away from. "I don't know how to stop it," I whispered. Daniel exhaled, like he had been holding his breath, waiting for me to say the words. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. But in that moment, something between us shattered. There was no going back. The moment stretched between us, thick and unbreakable. I could hear my heartbeat hammering in my chest, so loud I was sure Daniel could hear it too. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us moved. But the weight of everything unsaid filled the air between us, pressing down on me, making it impossible to breathe. Then, slowly, so slowly it felt like time itself had slowed down, Daniel reached out. He didn't touch me. Not yet. His fingers hovered just inches from mine, a silent question. A test. I should have pulled away. I should have broken whatever this was before it could go any further. but I didn't. Instead, I let my hand shift, just enough that our fingertips brushed. It was barely a touch, but it was enough. Daniel inhaled sharply, his eyes searching mine, looking for hesitation, for doubt. I had plenty of both, but in that moment, none of it mattered. I was tired of running, tired of pretending I didn't feel what I felt. So when he whispered, "Are you sure?" I didn't trust my voice to answer. Instead, I nodded. That was all it took. The tension snapped, years of unspoken feelings spilling over in an instant. Daniel's hand closed over mine, warm and steady. It should have felt wrong. It did feel wrong. But it also felt inevitable, like something we had been fighting for so long that it had only grown stronger. I didn't know what this meant. I didn't know what would happen next. But as Daniel's fingers tightened around mine, as the silence between us filled with the sound of our unsteady breaths, I knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back. The line we had been trying not to cross, we had just erased it.